What makes me happy in my life is my family, of course. Soccer, my dogs, and this being able to hang out with my friends and going places. What people misunderstand about like being suicidal is that like we don't want to die. We rather just get the pain away from us.
I think there's a lot of things that people don't understand about suicide because they've never experienced it or loved someone who's experienced it. And I'm still learning every day about it. I think a lot of times, when you're talking about young children, people assume they're too young to really experience depression. So they assume it's teenage angst, or they're just moody, or it's hormones, it's puberty, they'll grow out of it. And it's not always that. Sometimes it is a valid mental health issue.
Kids are a blessing in any form in which they come. And we struggled to have kids biologically. And as we started to progress into different treatments or interventions that we could do, we decided for ourselves that why would we go to this much effort when there are amazing kids that really need a good home? And perhaps we could be that home for them.
First, we adopted our daughter MJ from Russia when she was 8 months old. My husband and I knew we wanted to adopt again, but we didn't know where or how. It's very expensive in a lot of cases, and it can be time consuming, and we didn't want there to be a huge age gap between our children. So I was telling this story to my hairdresser, who happened to be an old-time family friend of my husband's, and telling her that we wanted our daughter to have a sibling, but we weren't sure what that was going to look like. And a few weeks later, she called my cell phone. I was at work, and she said, my grandson's girlfriend is pregnant, and she's going to end the pregnancy tomorrow unless you want the baby. Do you want the baby? And so, can I have a minute? So that was on a Thursday. So my husband and I dropped everything and went to meet her that weekend.
We always noticed when he was a very little infant, he was a very angry little infant, and it would not take much to set him off. But we also didn't have all that great of a point of comparison. Maddie was 8 months old, Heyden being a newborn. We don't know what we don't know. What's normal, what's not normal until you experience it.
So at first, we thought it was our parenting style. We thought maybe we weren't giving him the right kind of timeouts or the right kind of things in order to have him behave well. A lot of times it looks like behavioral issues, but we were doing all the things that we had done with our other child. And so we started talking about, should we go to the doctor, should we not? And we both questioned it for a couple of months, kind of going back and forth.
We started to take note that Heyden would have days that were really, really dark, and that he struggled to communicate what it was that was giving him a problem. And without being able to know the symptoms and be able to verbalize that, it's hard to diagnose what's going on. And so you just sit back and you listen and you support. And you find out from your child over time, behavior, the way they react to different stimuli, all these things, you become very analytical. And then you start to try to connect, triggers with results. And when we realized that we could not do that, we couldn't say this was a trigger that yielded this result. We would see the result with no trigger at all, and it would go from 0 to 100 miles an hour without any type of input. Then we started to realize there's probably more going on here than just having a hot temper or reacting to things a little bit more with more fervor than maybe other people would do.
So when they're 2 or 3, you hear all about the terrible 2s and how no, really the 3s are worse. But his tantrums had started escalating to anger and self-harm. Our next door neighbor, who he loved, had died. Our dog had died. My grandfather had died. And then our son broke his arm at school. And following that, we had severe anxiety set in and very complicated questions about death coming from this 3, almost 4-year-old. When he was 3, out of the blue, he would have an emotional breakdown and be crying. And I think he didn't know why, and we didn't know why. And so when we asked him, he would say, because the dog died, because she went to heaven.
We started to realize that it was not necessarily the dog, although we all miss the dog to this day. It was a great dog. But that he was utilizing that as an example to illustrate the way he felt. That he felt that emptiness, that sadness, the bereavement, the mourning that you feel. But it was, again, independent of any trigger. So that was just the way he felt inside. And when we started to realize that he was just not able to enunciate it, because these are pretty advanced topics for somebody that young, the idea of death and dying is something that takes a tremendous amount of evolution of your own soul and your own mind and your own ability to understand your emotions. And it just wasn't there for him yet. So he was speaking more metaphorically. And so we started to realize, all right, what he's doing is telling us how he feels, but in a way that we would understand and that he understands, and that we needed to learn his language at the time to figure it out.
He would talk a lot about there being something inside him that he couldn't control. He would say, there's a devil inside me. And we don't use words like devil and things like that. The church we attended at the time did not use words like devil, and that was not something that he was exposed to.
That was a point where we thought, what little 3, 4, 5-year-old kid says that? And the answer was that there's really not any. That was not language that he was exposed to, or a mindset. So then I almost thought maybe it was schizophrenia, perhaps. Maybe he was hearing voices. Maybe there were different things going on that were way out of our ability to diagnose.
And that's when we thought, we've got to get some help and find out what this is. We decided to start with our pediatrician. And I guess I wasn't sure what the pediatrician would say. I don't know if I was looking for parenting advice, but after we explained everything, he said, you need to take him to a child psychiatrist. My son was 3. It's not something you expect to hear when your son is 3. So I began my search for a psychiatrist for our son. And I work in the healthcare industry with insurance all day long. And so this is something that comes second nature to me. And yet I almost gave up because of how difficult the mental health system in the United States is to navigate. So several of them had 6 to 12-month waiting lists because children's psychiatrists are even more in demand and scarce than even psychiatrists for adults. Most would not take insurance. I had really great insurance through my employer, but most of the child psychiatrists were self-pay only, and it was very expensive, especially with repeated visits. I even called a university system that was near the area we lived in at the time, and they had many child psychiatrists on board. And when I explained my son's symptoms, the woman on the phone said, oh, he's too severe, we can't help you. And they were the last psychiatrists on my list at that point to call. And I remember hanging up the phone and thinking, what are we going to do? I want to help my son. He needs help, but I can't get him in anywhere. And then to hear someone say, your 3-year-old is too severe? He was a normal kid most of the time. He played with other kids, he had friends, he did all the things a 3-year-old does. And he was too severe, in their opinion. We finally found one psychiatrist over an hour away who would take our insurance and didn't have a several-month wait. And the psychiatrist said that the questions he was asking us about death and separation were what normally an 8 or 9-year-old would be asking. So he said he's intellectually asking you 8 or 9-year-old questions, but he only has the emotions of a 3-year-old to process it. So this is what was causing his anxiety, which in him presented as anger. Once we got in to see the child psychiatrist, they had a bunch of screening tools that screened our son for a lot of different mental health conditions. Obviously, he could not fill out the form himself, so we had to write things that we observed, yes or no, did these apply to him, how often? And then they even had us take the form to his daycare and have his teachers fill it out too, since sometimes kids act differently with other people than they're with you. And they did diagnose him with generalized anxiety disorder at that time. And we started him on a low-dose medication at age 4.
Bringing medication into the fold was terrifying because the minute you add an intervention, you're changing the course of things. And at what point do you mask things that you need to see in order to properly diagnose and to properly help your child get through what is incredibly massive on their part? And so there was always that concern, are we masking this or are we improving it? And how do you know that over time? Especially with somebody that's very young and that can't really enunciate the things that they're feeling.
My husband and I started reading about the medication that they had recommended and reading the research of how, when it had been used on younger children. And what we learned is that if by medicating children when they're young, they can learn coping skills and learn what it feels like to not wrestle with these really intense emotions before their personality sets in during their teen years. So based on that, we decided to go ahead with the medication. And we took a lot of criticism. Even some of our own family members.
It's Jen and I's job to put our son in the best position we can be in. And we have the ability to take all of the input that we see that many people don't into our calculus in what we decide we're going to do. I see dissenting opinion as valuable as people that approve, because it's challenging our position every time.
When I even just mentioned I made an appointment with a psychiatrist, before I even could say why, I had a family member jump in and say, don't let them medicate him. Whatever you do, don't medicate him. They didn't even know the story. And really at that point, I kind of quit telling the details to people because I felt very judged and alone at that point, just my husband and I on an island. But when we started the medication, it gave us our son back.
I was aware that he had a mental illness, but I didn't understand fully what was going on. I know my brother went to the doctor a lot, but I never understood why because he wasn't really sick.
For a couple of years, things kind of calmed down and we felt like we were managing things well with medication and therapy. And then around age 8, things started to change. Up until that time, his symptoms had been primarily anxiety driven. So anger and frustration, that was really the manifestation of anxiety. But around age 8, we started to see depression emerge. And at first, we didn't really know it was signs of depression because who looks for signs of a depression in an 8-year-old? He had a roof over his head and a loving family and food and activities and everything that an 8-year-old could want. But we started noticing that he was becoming withdrawn. He was not expressing as much emotion about things. He would sometimes crash for really long periods of time and sleep for longer extended periods of time. And the first time he verbalized not wanting to live was at age 8. I think, like a lot of people, we kind of had a misperception at that time that a child that age wouldn't really even know what that is. And so, is it for attention? Is it just something he heard? And so, in a way, we probably didn't give it enough credit when it first happened. And so I think it was kind of just a passing, like, hey, did you hear Heyden say this today? It wasn't like a big conversation. And then I started researching, how young does suicide start? What is the average teenage age for suicide? And I started reading these articles and firsthand accounts of suicide affecting really young children. I was shocked. I had been kind of sheltered, or maybe not given it enough thought up until that point. Suicide was something that you heard about, but I didn't know anything about it firsthand. And I was suddenly learning that, yes, my son at age 8 can be feeling that. And so there was one day where my husband experienced a moment with him, and we both after that said, this is real, we've got to find more help.
Heyden went into his room to play, which was not abnormal. The door is usually open. I was in the living room, which was, within sight of his room. And I didn't see him for a while. And so, parents, you do your job, right? If it's quiet, something's up. And I knocked on his door, and I didn't hear anything. And I opened up the door, and I found Heyden laying in his bed, crying and shaking, physically shaking uncontrollably, almost like it seemed chemical. It seemed like he was terrified. And he just asked me to help him. He just said over and over again, please help me. I'm so tired. Please help me. And, what do you do in that situation? You hug your kid and you tell them it's okay, but you can't define what okay really is. You just know that they're terrified. And whatever it is that's affecting them is incredibly real to them at that point in time. And as a parent, you want to fix it.
We were still under the care of a psychiatrist at that time, so to get more help, we contacted his psychiatrist. We also notified his therapist, and then by this time, he was in the public school system, so we reached out to the school counselor as well, and we asked the teachers to be on alert for certain behaviors. And so that's kind of where we started. Around age 10, things got more serious. Episodes were happening at school. He was saying he wanted to die at school. He was getting screened for suicide risk at school. And we would get these phone calls during the day from the school about episodes. And I had always had a level of anxiety, but this created a whole new level of anxiety in me. If it was during the school day and the phone rang, I instantly panicked. My first thought was, what has happened?
I hate phones now because I don't know what that ring is going to be. I always appear very calm and laid back, but I'm very much kind of a tempest in a teapot, that my brain is going a million different miles an hour. And I'm constantly thinking, what if this happens? What if that happens? And everybody sees me as being fairly prepared for most situations just because I've exhaustively prepared for every situation, both rational and not.
There was this one time when my brother was at home by himself. My dad was out of town, and my mom and me were out shopping.
My son called us on the phone and said he couldn't take the pain anymore and he was going to end it. And I couldn't get home fast enough. I mean, that was probably the most terrifying moment in my life. I was about a 20-minute drive away.
Just watching my mom She was so scared. She looked like she was about to cry, but she knew that she had to be strong in front of me.
For whatever reason, the part of the brain that uses math would de-escalate any kind of emotional escalation that was happening. So if we could get him to focus on math problems, it would eventually break the focus on the emotional escalation. So we were driving home and I had him on speakerphone and I was trying to do math with him while I'm driving, while my daughter is sitting next to me. She's terrified. And the way it worked is we'd start with small numbers and work our way up to big. 5 plus 5 is 10. 10 plus 10 is 20. 20 plus 100 is 120. And we would keep going until the math would get so big that I told my daughter to get her calculator out because I could no longer do the math in my head, especially while driving and anxious. But that is what got him to put the knife down. And he was safe when we got home.
I couldn't talk to my mom because she was really distracted by what had happened to Heyden and she didn't really know what to do. I remember that everything just went really quiet. We just were listening to my mom and him talk about what was going on.
It was a suicidal episode, but it's very common for me not to notice or realize it happened after because of my adrenaline. I go to sleep after usually. I wake up the next day and I remember that I had one. I just don't remember the details about it.
I don't know that I would have recognized that someone can have an episode or escalation and then have no memory of it the next day. That was kind of new information, but I've seen it happen time and time again with our son. Because we had had that escalation while we weren't home, and we consulted with his psychiatrist, we were recommended to not leave him alone for many years.
I work from home. I changed my entire life. So he would not have to be alone when he came home from school because he couldn't be alone when he came home from school.
The doctor said to hide all the knives in the house. And so for a while we had to hide them and we could only have like butter knives out. Whenever my grandfather came for Thanksgiving, my mom had to tell him that we had to hide the knives, and he didn't really understand, and that's what I was afraid of with all my friends, that they would never understand that because they don't know what I'm going through, what our whole family is going through.
I think when you see the media stories about suicides or you hear about a death where nobody's telling you how the person died, they're just saying they passed. A lot of times that's a suicide situation. And I think people think that those people are selfish or they didn't care about the people they left behind or that they, really, that all they were thinking about was themselves. But that's not true. From what my own son has told me and from what talking to other kids who have felt this and from the research I've done online, it really is the mental illness tricks their brain and they really do feel like they're a burden and that others would be better without them here. And the pain becomes so unbearable. But part of what I think leads to that pain is that they can't talk to anyone about it. So then when someone really does have a problem, who can they talk to?
In middle school, kids would make jokes like, "Oh, go kill yourself." I would never laugh at that. I would tell them that that's not something funny. People might actually take that to heart. I know someone who would. And they would stop for a little bit, but they would go right back to it.
So that's really where we started getting involved in mental health advocacy. And what can we do to help end the stigma? What can we do to keep the conversation going? How do we normalize talking about suicide? Since opening up about our son's story, I have had some acquaintances reach out to me, mostly through Facebook, and say, hey, it's really brave what you posted about your son, or I'm so glad you shared that. I don't know if you know, but my child has this or has that. The other thing that I didn't expect is teenagers started opening up to us. So, our kids, a lot of their friends started coming to us and saying, hey, can I talk to you about something? And there were some of them with suicidal thoughts. Kids you would never expect. The straight A student with a good home, no financial issues, involved in sports and activities, always the life of the party, laughing and joking. Guess what? That kid thought about ending his life last weekend, and nobody knew. Through this journey, one of the things I've learned about mental health is there's no one right answer or one solution. What works for one person may not work for someone else. And really, it's usually not just one thing that's the solution. We talk a lot about Heyden having a toolkit of tools available to him. So these are a combination of coping techniques that he's learned through therapy, different techniques he's given to redirect his thoughts, his medications. We were able to get a service dog through an organization called Pause for People. He became part of the treatment plan. From age 10 to 13 or 14, this was a huge part of his mental health recovery and journey. As he gets older, he needs him less and less on a daily basis, but also just having him there is still part of his overall therapy. It is something we're constantly managing and something that we're constantly changing and seeing what else is out there and what other options we have. And it's a lot of trial and error, but you just stick with it until you find out what works. Sometimes people make comments about how do you do it and how are you so open about it? And, they seem surprised that I share so much of the story. Yes, we have this hard stuff that we have to work through. And yes, this is stuff we didn't expect. But the rest of it is being a good parent. We show up at practices and we encourage their hobbies and we encourage them to try new things and support them when they're interested and listen to them when they're struggling. And I think part of it is kids just want to be heard and they want to be understood. My hope for the future is what any parent hopes, that your children lead a happy and productive life. And you don't want to think about your children suffering or struggling with something like this for the rest of their lives. And I want them to grow up in a world where they're not afraid to talk about the things they struggle with, because it is a medical condition and it's no different than other health conditions, and they shouldn't be embarrassed to talk about it. And that's what I hope for them, is a world full of people who understand, people who get them, and so they can feel connected to the world and be happy and live their best life.
Do you feel pretty loved?
I feel loved all the time, 24/7. I have parents that actually chose me and care.
At first, me and my brother were not close, but we fought a lot. We still fight to this day, but we are extremely close. We tell each other a lot of stuff. We don't tell each other everything, but we tell each other a lot. Like what's going on in school, all the drama that's going on. our boyfriend, girlfriend issues, like everything about that kind of stuff. I think I do feel protective over my brother. I think that I did at a young age, and that I needed to, but now I don't think I need to as much anymore.
I have no idea what makes a good parent because the needs of the children are all different. You have to be able to roll with the punches, and you have to listen. You have to tune out the noise and try to figure out what are the things that are truly important to the kids and to their being good humans and good adults that can live independently on their own and be the neighbor that you wish you had right now. Those are all nudges and just subtle bumps in navigating a big boat. And you hope that you have bumped and navigated the boat so that in 8,000 miles it ends up in the country that you're setting off to sail for. But I don't know the answer of what makes a good parent other than being there for your kid and not being afraid to say, you know what, I don't know. I don't know. This is something I've never seen before in my life, and I'm not gonna run from it. I'm gonna figure out a way to parent my kid and be there for him.